But he says, if, however, you and your sons turn away from following me, God will turn the temple into a heap of ruins and an object of derision. And we see, of course, that is the history of what we're reading here, is how this all came about, where God had told, warned Solomon from the beginning, this is what was going to happen if you turn away from me. And of course, we know that later on, that's exactly what Solomon does, sadly enough. Um, yeah, was a prophet. Not uh, well, in some sense, yes, he would have been. God is speaking to Solomon, and Solomon therefore is recording, apparently in some way, the word of God. And so somehow this message from God got into the record, and we can only assume that if God delivered it, we'll find out over in Second Chronicles when we look at that account. Um, Verse 12 of Second Chronicles 8, or of 7 rather, sorry. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon at night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. So here is this message delivered to Solomon at night. We don't know if it came in the form of a dream or a vision or exactly how it was delivered, but it was delivered, and somehow then apparently Solomon recorded it. So in that sense, yes, Solomon would have become for that purpose a prophet of God, a foreteller of the will of God, and delivering that both that warning and that message. If we read the account here in Second Chronicles, it gets into a little more, actually a little more detail of what was recorded. It says, verse 13, if I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or if I command the locusts to devour the land, or if I send pestilence among my people, and my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn away from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and will heal the land. So here is a promise and a warning, but along with that, a means of recovery, if you will, that's not recorded over in First Kings. If they sin and because of their sin, I withhold rain, or if I send the locust, or if I send pestilence, and then if they'll repent, then I'll hear it and I'll forgive them, and as he says, I will heal their land. And so we have that promise of that restoration, that promise of that recovery, but it's conditional. It is in every case conditional. He goes on in verse 15, now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house that my name may be here forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. And as for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, even to do according to all that I have commanded you, and you will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man to be ruler in Israel. Again, we see there the promise, and we see the conditionality of it. It is all conditional. It all depends on the behavior of Solomon and his sons. Again, though, I think this account in Chronicles is interesting in that it does give allowance for how they might recover if they stumble. Basically, if they fall, they can still recover, which again is not mentioned in the account in Kings. So I find that kind of interesting that the Chronicles gives a little more um, uh, depth, if you will, a little more detail than what we get from Kings. He says, but if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot you from my land, which I have given you, and this house, which I have consecrated for my name, and I will cast you out of my sight, and I'll make it a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. Um, they're using the word uproot, which is a little stronger. It is a little stronger. It is a little more forceful. That uproot has the connotation of utterly destroy and completely destroy. This is not it gets a little more, again, it's a little more of effect of what's going to happen here to these people. Um, and as for this house which was exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? And they will say, because they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them from the land of Egypt, and they adopted other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore he has brought all this adversity on them. And so again, there is the warning. I can, this house, this beautiful house that Solomon has just completed building, and we read about the magnificence of it and the great amounts of materials that went into it, and the opulence of it, the gold and the fine stones and the precious stones and all of the fine materials that were used to construct it. And no doubt, looking at this beautiful structure, it would have been a magnificent structure. It would have set up on that hill by Jerusalem. It would have gleamed. It would have been just a fantastic building. And God says, "I'll turn this into a heap of rubble if you don't stay with me. If you don't stay and continue to do what I'm commanding you to do, I can turn this into a heap of rubble." And I will turn it into a heap of rubble. And of course, we know later on that's exactly what he did do, through the hands of those other nations around about it. He did turn it in, and for exactly the reason he described. And as you see here, he makes sure they know why. Why was this turned into a heap of rubble? Well, because they adopted other gods and worshiped them. You're going to do that? Well, I'll turn this into a heap of stone. And so again, we see that warning and that construction. Okay. Any questions on that? We go then on. I want to go. This now is back to the book of Kings. This is a little aside, if you will, that it's not in Chronicles, and the reason it's not in Chronicles probably because it's not terribly flattering to Solomon. Chronicles tends to be a little more, well, if you will, flattering, because that was the purpose of the book, was sort of a national unity. Kings is a little more blunt about some of the things that went on. So here we have this account in 1 Kings, and this is in 1 Kings 9, and we see that here is this continuing interactions that we have between Solomon and Hiram, the king of Tyre. Verse 10, it came about at the end of 20 years at which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house. Hiram, the king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold according to all his desire, and Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So this is a trade-off, if you will. There are many Bible scholars who suggest that Solomon's fairly aggressive construction policies had outstripped his ability to pay Hiram what he had promised to pay him. That Solomon was kind of struggling to keep up the payments that he had promised. We read about some of those terms back in earlier parts of Kings and in Chronicles, some of the very generous conditions or very generous allotments that Solomon had made for Hiram, sending him enormous quantities of grain and oil and other goods, and that a lot of scholars did feel that Solomon, for whatever reason, was having trouble kind of keeping up on it. So he decides to, if you will, either give or mortgage. Most of the scholars feel this was more like a mortgage. I'm going to give you the use of this area for a period of time, and I'm going to give you these 20 cities, but it's not permanent. It's just it was going to be a temporary thing, sort of like a mortgage. Well, I'm going to mortgage this, and we'll have them. You'll have the goods for a period of time. So Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they did not please him. And he said, "What are these cities which you've given me, my brother?" So they called the land of Cabul to this day, And Hiram sent to the king 120 talents of gold. So again, here's this transaction that's going on. Apparently, there was this in verse 14, this 120 talents of gold. This was not a gift. This would have been a loan. We would, hey, I'm going to mortgage my property and I'm going to take out a loan here, is what a lot of the scholars think was going on. And so I'm going to mortgage this. And so he does. Well, Hiram goes out to inspect these cities, and he's like, again, most of the scholars would look at this, we're thinking that Hiram's expecting to find some maybe nice grain producing land, some, maybe some well-established lands that he could use for his own. And instead he finds this basically hill country, undeveloped or underdeveloped, and basically calls it worthless. That's the kind of the meaning of the word Cabal, is good for nothing. It was kind of scrub land. I mean, that would have been the basic description of it. We all have seen land around even Indiana where it's really not good for farming. Doesn't seem to be good for much of even grazing animals. Doesn't really seem to be much good for anything. And it's barren. It says barren year after year after year. Well, the same sort of thing was here. That all this land is sitting there and it's just kind of barren. And so he's, as you understand, not terribly happy about it. And ultimately, we're going to find he returns it back to Solomon, saying, in effect, thank you, but no thank you. This land, as it says here, it was the land around the Sea of Galilee. It would later be called the Galilee of the Gentiles because, yes, there were Jews living in this area. Later, we find that Solomon will try to develop this area a little bit as a way of enticing the Israelites to move in and build there. But this land is really mostly held by the Phoenicians and some of the Canaanites, and it will be continually be seen as a poor or rather backward area of Israel. And even when we get down to Jesus' time, we find out that it's still got this connotation of it, of being essentially a good-for-nothing place. If we go over to John, look over in the book of John, for example, and chapter 7, and down to the end of it. And I think I might back all the way back up to verse 45. The officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said to him, "Why did you not bring him?" The officers said, "Never has a man spoken the way this man speaks." The Pharisees then answered them, you have not also been led astray, have you? Now, not one of the rulers of the Pharisees have believed in him, has he? But this crowd which does not know the law is accursed. Nicodemus, he who came to him before, being one of them, said to them, "Our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it?" And so here's Nicodemus trying to defend Jesus. They answered him and said, "You are not also from Galilee, are you? Search out and see that no prophet arises out of Galilee." And so here is that account where you can kind of get the understanding of what's going on here. Oh, here's Jesus. Well, he's from Galilee. It'd be, are you kidding? He's from Galilee. It'd be like sort of us maybe talking about somebody from the region up in, the northwestern Indiana or something like that, where those folks are kind of seen as, I don't know, maybe backwater or maybe uneducated or maybe just kind of a very rustic. And they're making fun of Nicodemus, trying to say, wait a minute, you're not from Galilee, are you? And you can understand that they've got this connotation about the place that it is it's low quality. I mean, that's just the bottom line here. Galilee's low quality, and I think part of that even comes back. We see that reflected back here in 1 Kings 10. Um, so now we go on from there to see some of the things that Solomon is doing, though. We understand these fantastic construction projects he's got going on. Um, now, this is the account of the forced labor, which Solomon, this is verse 15 of 1 Kings 10. Now, this is the account of the forced labor which King Solomon levied to build the house of the Lord, his own house, the Milio, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. For Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it with fire and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city and had given it as a dowry to his daughter Solomon's wife. So Solomon rebuilt Gezer and the lower Beth Horon and Baalath and Tamar and the wilderness in the land of Judah, and all of the storage cities which Solomon had, even the cities for his chariots and the cities of his horsemen, and all that pleased Solomon to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and in the land under his rule. For all of the people who were left of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of the son of Israel, their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the sons of Israel were unable to destroy utterly, from them Solomon levied forced labors even to this day. But Solomon did not make slaves of the sons of Israel, for they were men of war, his servants, his princes, his captains, his chariot commanders, and his horsemen. If we see what happens here, all right, this is a little small, but you can see something of the map here, and you can see here we've got this area with the blue line, and that is pretty much the area over which Solomon had, if not rule, he had great influence over all of this area. And we can see it stretches all the way from the Euphrates River in the northern and northeastern part of the nation, all the way down to the border with Egypt. And so he's got all this area, and he's building these cities, and it may be hard to see, but you can see some of them in here. Here's Gath, and here's Megiddo, and some of the other. Megiddo would have been right in this area. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing Megiddo show up as I was hoping it would. But he built these fortress cities. We would call them fortress cities, or essentially military compounds. That's what they effectively were military compounds. And he's building them. Why? Because this is the major. This is the area with the major north-south roadways, highways, if you will, between Egypt and the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and all the way up, and even the east coast of Africa, Ethiopia, and all of those countries, to go north into the land where the Phoenicians, the Hittites, and into the Mesopotamian area for trade. And so this was a tremendous travel route along this coast like this, and this was a great source of income to the nation of Israel, as they were controlling these roadways and undoubtedly charging tolls to go through. And you can understand that Solomon would want to make sure that this area was not disrupted by invaders. And so he builds these essentially military facilities, these military bases. They become cities, but they are built along this area that is from north to south, where he can kind of keep an eye on who's traveling through. We see his other construction projects. We understand, again, they control these major roads running north and south. He wanted to protect these resources. He uses the Canaanites who are left in the land as a source of slave labor. We understand that. But the Bible is specific here to call out that the children of Israel, the men of Israel themselves, are not used in this way. We'll find that, and if we read the parallel account over in 2 Chronicles 9, and here is this passage, and it says, chapter 8, verse 1 of 2nd Chronicles. I came about at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the house of the Lord in his own house, and he built cities which Huram had given him and settled the sons of Israel there. So he had even houses or cities then up into the land of what we would call Phoenicia, around Tyre and Sidon. Then Solomon went to Hamath-Zorab and captured it. So if we go back here, this is the area up here of Hamath. This is that whole area in that. Can you see that? Oh, it's not showing up. There we go. How's that? Yeah. This is the area called Hamath up in this area, and so he's capturing up in this area. That's the area called Hamath, and one of their major cities up there is Hamath. As we see here, is Hamath-Zobah, and he captures it. He builds Tadmor and the wilderness and all the storage cities which he built at Hamath. He also built Upper Beth Horon and Lower Beth Horon, fortified cities with walls, gates, and bars. We would call these military forts or military compounds. And Baalath and all the storage cities that Solomon had, and all of the cities for his chariots, and the cities for his horsemen, and all that pleased Solomon to build in Jerusalem, in Lebanon, and all the land under his rule. And then we've already read about his enslavement of the various Canaanite nations that were still left. And we see, though, this is interesting, though, in verse, and some of the organization, verse 10, these were the chief officers of King Solomon, 250 who ruled over the people. So here we find out he's organized these workers into work groups and set overseers over them. Verse 11, then Solomon brought Pharaoh's daughter up from the city of David to the house which he had built before her, for he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy where the ark of the Lord is entered. So here we find that's kind of an interesting point of view from Solomon at this point in his life, that he's taking his wife out of the city of David. He's taking her out away from this area where the ark is passed through, because he said these places are holy and they're for Israelites and not for this Egyptian woman. And so it's kind of an interesting, commentary about his view. We see that in his early years, Solomon appears to be a very religious man, a very dedicated worshiper of Jehovah. We see that in the next verse, a couple of verses. Then Solomon offered burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before the porch, and he did according to the daily rule, offering them up according to the commandment of Moses for the Sabbaths, the new moons, and the 3 annual feasts, the feast of the unleavened bread, the feast of weeks, and the feast of booths. Now, according to the ordinance of his father David, he appointed the divisions of the priests of their service and the Levites for their duties of praise and ministering before the priests, according to the daily rule, and the gatekeepers by their divisions at every gate, for David, the man of God, had so commanded. And they did not depart from the commandment of the king to the priests and the Levites in any manner or concerning the storehouses. Thus all the work of Solomon was carried out from the day of the foundation of the house of the Lord until it was finished and the house of the Lord was completed. You see that organization? We've got, there are some, you've heard me refer to the one commentator named Kaufman. Kaufman is fairly acidic toward Solomon, and he wants to try and suggest that it was Solomon himself who was offering these sacrifices, that he himself took on the role of the priest. I don't agree with him. I think he's letting his own dislike of Solomon get in the way of talking about the truth. But that was the argument. You see the same sort of thing in 1 Kings 24. As soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built for her, he built the Milio. What's the Milio? Well, it's a kind of an obscure word. It literally means the filling in, or the filling, if you will. And it refers to, apparently, according to the Bible scholars who look at this, that word simply means, apparently there was a section of Jerusalem, a ravine there, where they wanted to build the wall, and it was a ravine. So they filled it in, and apparently it was a fairly significant amount of work, and they decided to label it as such. But as far as being of significance to us, really it isn't. It's just again probably part of the construction of the wall. Yeah, Bill. Yeah, yeah, yes, I know that. But the fact that over in Second Chronicles it says that it was all done according to the commandment of Moses suggests that yes, Solomon did it, but he did it, uh, by the hands of the priests as it was supposed to be done. That Solomon didn't physically do it himself. That's the way I understand it too. I think Kaufman's way off base on this one, and yeah, he's letting his dislike for Solomon taint his viewpoint, unfortunately. But yeah, I think that Solomon organized it and directed the priests to do it, and maybe even supplied them with the materials. But Solomon did not, by his own hand, do that. Now we get down to the end of chapter 9, and this is fairly significant. I want to kind of point this out. Chapter 9, in 1 Kings 10, or I'm sorry, 1 Kings 9, these last couple of verses, and also in 2 Chronicles 8, and the last couple of verses. And we see here that King Solomon built a fleet of ships in Ezon Geber, which is near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. And Hiram sent his servants with the fleets, sailors who knew the sea, along with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. We see the same kind of language over again in 2 Chronicles 8, verse 17, where they're building essentially this southern fleet, this southern trading fleet, out of what we would know as it's you can kind of see it. I should have kind of probably could try to blow this picture up a little bit. Let me see if I can do that. A little better. Should have done that earlier. Pardon? Oh, good. So we can get it back. There we go. All right. And so he sends ships down to Ophir. Well, where he's at, where this is being built, is what we would know today as the Gulf of Aqaba, which is right about here. See that? You can see that inlet of land off the Red Sea. That's the Gulf of Aqaba, and all of the scholars agree that's where this fleet was launched from, in this Gulf of Aqaba. Now, why is that significant? Well, if you look at verse 26 of 1 Kings 9, you'll find some of you may even have this as an alternative reading of this passage. There in verse 26, he says, which is near the Eloth on the shore of the Reed Sea, or Sea of Reeds. And some Bible skeptics have tried to use back in Exodus, if we read back in Exodus and we read about the Sea of Reeds and Moses crossing the Red Sea, and they want to try and translate that as the Sea of Reeds. And they say, well, no, Moses didn't cross the Red Sea. Moses crossed the Sea of Reeds, which was marshy ground. Well, of course, we know that's a ridiculous idea because, first of all, it says that the wall was a water. The water was a wall on either side of them, and ultimately it drowned the Egyptians in pursuit. And you're not going to drown the Egyptians in a couple of inches in marshy water. And so we know, first of all, that's ridiculous. But they're trying. No, he didn't cross the Red Sea. He crossed the Sea of Reeds, which is just marshy ground. No, because they use exactly the same phrase here for this Gulf of Aqaba location. It's exactly the same word, and it clearly means the Red Sea, where we see the Red Sea there. And so they're launching their ships out of this area to go south. You can understand why Tyre, Hiram of Tyre would have been interested in this. Hiram's got no good way to get there. He's up here on the coast up here, and he's doing a lot of trading in the Mediterranean and visiting a lot of cities in the Mediterranean, but he's got no good way to get down onto the Red Sea. He really doesn't have a good way to get down on the Red Sea. But now, with his alliance with Solomon, now he's got a way to get down into this area where here is Ophir. They put it, you see Ophir, and they put it on the west coast of Arabian Peninsula there, about Yemen, where modern day Yemen is. But some people think, or some scholars even think, this could have been yet further south on the east coast of Africa, and refers to some cities that were there in what is today modern day Sudan or Ethiopia. And so that's where Ophir is. And so there's some question about that, but you can imagine there would have been a lot of potential goods that could come out of that land and travel north. And Hiram, of course, would have been entirely interested in gathering up some of that material that he could then carry into the Mediterranean and make a lot of money trading. And in fact, that's apparently what they did do, because as we see here, they went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there. And the suggestion is probably not by conquest, but by trade. That there was apparently a lot of gold to be had there, and they were going to be able to make a lot of money. So they were very interested and excited about that. Again, we see in these accounts that early in his reign, Solomon is a dedicated worshiper of God. He's got this fleet down there in Aqaba, in that Gulf of Aqaba, and launches from there. Now, we get next then into 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9. And this is the visit from the Queen of Sheba. And so we'll read these accounts. It says now, this is chapter 10, verse 1. Now, when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with difficult questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very large retinue, with camels carrying spices and very much gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from the king, which he did not explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, and the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters and their attire, his cupbearers, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, it was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came with my eyes, and my eyes have seen it. Now behold, the half was not even told to me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. How blessed are your men, how blessed are your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore, he made you king to do justice and righteousness. And so here we have that introduction of the Queen of Sheba. We see again the same thing over in 2 Chronicles 9, verses 1 through 8 is virtually identical in the context of what is said there. Where was Sheba from? Well, if we go back to the kind of this map a little bit, again, there's a question of there's a lot of speculation about where the Queen of Sheba might have come from. Some suggest she's down here further south on the Arabian Peninsula, down around where Yemen or even Saudi Arabia would be today. Some have even suggested that she would have been around into the area where is today Pakistan or India. And others would put her down on the east coast of Africa, as far south as Ethiopia, and from that region down here further south. In fact, the Ethiopians, for a period of time, claimed, at least their leadership claimed, to be descendants of Solomon. That they claimed that Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had sexual relations, had children, and when she went back to Ethiopia, she was with child, and from that came a race of the rulers of Ethiopia out of Solomon. In fact, the point is made that even in modern time, one of the recent rulers of Ethiopia, a fellow by the name of Haile Selassie, claimed to be a descendant of Solomon. So whether this is true or not is pure speculation. I got to admit that it is pure speculation. But here we find this woman would have traveled something like, to the best estimates, something like 1,500 miles, which would have been an enormous journey in this day, with her retinue of camels and guards and servants and so forth. It would have been an enormous journey to undertake. Why would she want to undertake this? Well, because Solomon and the nation of Israel was rapidly becoming a major trading center, or a major trading broker, if you will. And therefore, she's interested in having that relationship with him as a way of moving goods out of her area of Ethiopia into, if that's where she's from, or the southern Arabian Peninsula, or even India. There is some indication that some of these ships were going as far east as India and were engaged in trade there. And so you can imagine how this network that Solomon has built, this trading network, is building up and allowing for a tremendous flow of wealth up through the Africa and India and southern Arabia, through Israel, and then out into the Mediterranean via the alliance with Hiram of Tyre. So you can see this was big business. This was a significant business for them. All right, I'm going to stop there. You got any questions or comments? I'm going to stop there. Yeah, Tim? Yeah. 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 Well, there's a question about how much of that was really her amazement at his knowledge, and how much of it was flattery because she's looking for a good trading partner. So who knows? But that's a good point. That is an interesting point. All right. Thanks for your attention and comments today. We'll continue on with that next week.